Three men stood inside a classified operations room in Brussels and watched a red dot vanish from the satellite feed. One of them laughed. Another poured scotch. The third, a man with 4 stars on his collar and a defense contract worth $9 billion, simply said, "Clean." They believed the Atlantic Ocean had done what 3 years of intimidation, surveillance, and one staged helicopter crash had failed to accomplish. They believed Rachel Voss was dead. She wasn't. 71 hours later, a NATO rescue crew spotted something that made the pilot question his instruments. A woman, alone, still moving, clutching a waterproof pack to her chest like it was the only thing in the world worth saving. Because it was. If this story already has you locked in, follow the channel, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The storm that nearly killed Rachel Voss had been named Isolde by meteorologists, which struck the fishermen of Crestmore Bay as darkly appropriate. Isolde, a doomed woman, a love story with a body count. The storm had rolled off the North Atlantic in early November with the kind of sustained fury that didn't care about shipping lanes or survival gear or the plans of people who thought they were prepared. Rachel had gone into the water on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, the search and rescue coordinator for the Crestmore Coast Guard District had already written the incident summary in past tense. Presumed deceased. Body not recovered. Case transferred to casualty processing. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? The water temperature at the crash site had been 4 degrees Celsius. Exposure survival windows in those conditions were measured in minutes, not hours, certainly not days. The survival experts brought in for the media briefing used words like unsurvivable and physiologically impossible, with the calm confidence of people who hadn't been wrong about something in a long time. They were wrong about this. Lieutenant Commander Damon Hale had been flying SAR missions off the coast of Nova Scotia for 11 years. He'd pulled living people from burning cargo ships. He'd once hauled a barely breathing fisherman from wreckage that had been underwater for over an hour. He'd also recovered 17 bodies in those 11 years, and he knew the difference. By color, by stillness, by the particular way the sea held on to something it had already claimed. What he saw on the surface of the water at 0612 on Thursday morning was not a body. "Coming around," he said into the headset. His co-pilot squinted through the windscreen. "Debris cluster, 4 o'clock, probably from the—" "No." Hale was already banking. "Something's moving in it." "Damon, the water temp is—" "I know what the water temp is. I'm going around." The rescue swimmer, a 24-year-old named Briggs who had been doing this job for less than 2 years, saw it clearly on the second pass. A figure in the debris field, face up. One arm extended upward, not waving, not calling for help, just extended, like she was pointing at the sky. In her other arm, pressed flat against her chest, a dark green waterproof pack. "She's alive," Briggs said. He sounded like he didn't entirely believe it himself. "Get in the water," Hale said. "Don't." By the time the helicopter set down at Iron Cliff Military Medical Center on the outskirts of Varden, Nova Scotia, the woman had been hypothermic for what the attending physicians estimated was somewhere between 60 and 72 hours. Her core temperature on arrival was 28.1 degrees Celsius, low enough that her heart should have given out long before Briggs ever hit the water. The ER team moved fast. They knew what to do. Active rewarming, cardiac monitoring, fluid resuscitation, the whole controlled chaos choreography of a trauma bay working at full speed. What slowed them down was the bag. She wouldn't let go of it. Not in the helicopter, not during triage, not when 2 nurses physically tried to pry her fingers loose so they could get a better IV line placed. Her grip was weak. Her hands were shaking with the fine, uncontrolled tremor of severe hypothermia, but her intention was unmistakable. The fingers tightened every time someone reached for the pack. "Ma'am, we need you to— Don't." Her voice was barely audible, wrecked from cold and salt water. But the word came out clean. No confusion, no delirium. "Don't touch it." The charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Aldrich, who had been doing emergency medicine for 20 years and had exactly zero patience for patient noncompliance during active resuscitation, leaned in close. "We are trying to save your life. The bag goes on the shelf. You can have it back when—" "If you take that bag," the woman said, still barely above a whisper, "everything I just survived out there means nothing." Aldrich straightened up, looked at the bag, looked at her. He left the bag where it was. Asham. It was Lieutenant Commander Damon Hale who found out her name. Not because he dug through the wreckage for identification. He'd already been told that the crash manifest listed only cargo and 2 contracted crew members whose remains had been tentatively located 6 miles from the debris field where Rachel was found. It was because once her core temperature climbed back above 32 degrees and her cognition started to clear, she told him herself. He was sitting in a chair beside her bed in the ICU, still in his flight suit, because no one had told him to leave and he hadn't thought to ask. She'd been unconscious for most of the last 4 hours. When her eyes opened, they went straight to the bag on the bedside table. Then they moved to him. "You're the pilot," she said. "Co-pilot spotted you first. Rescue swimmer went in. But you turned the aircraft around." He didn't answer that, just nodded. She looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Her breathing was still labored. Her lips were cracked and dark at the corners. The monitors beside her beeped with mechanical indifference. "Rachel Voss," she said. "That's my name. I'm 32 years old. I was a U.S. Army combat nurse. I got out 4 years ago." A pause. "That bag doesn't leave my sight." "Okay. I'm serious." "I understand." She turned her head to look at him directly. Her eyes were dark and very steady for someone who had just survived something that had killed better prepared people in a fraction of the time. "Do you? Because there are people who know I survived. They'll know within hours if they don't already, and when they find out, they'll come here." Hale leaned forward in the chair. "Who will?" Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes again. "The people who put me in the water," she said. "The hospital administrator, a trim, permanently harried woman named Director Patrice Osman, was not pleased to learn that her facility had become the center of what was shaping up to be an unexplained maritime survival incident with possible security implications. She was even less pleased when Lieutenant Commander Hale requested, politely, but with the particular firmness of someone who wasn't actually making a request, that access to the ICU be restricted to essential staff only. "This is a military medical center, not a safe house," Osman said. "Yes, ma'am. I understand that. You're a SAR pilot, Commander. Your job was to bring her here. That's done. With respect, Director, I'd like to stay a little longer." Osman looked at him. She had been running Ironcliff for 6 years. She'd dealt with high-value patients before, brass government contractors, once a sitting senator with chest pains and a paranoid security detail. She knew what it looked like when someone smelled something wrong before they could articulate what it was. She approved the restriction order. The woman in the ICU slept for another 9 hours. When she woke the second time, it was 2 a.m., and Hale was still there, halfway through a terrible cup of vending machine coffee. The floor was quiet. The monitors were steady. "You're still here," she said. "I am." "Why?" He thought about that honestly for a second. "Because I turned that aircraft around and pulled you out of the water, and I'd like to know that was the right call." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, too tired for that. "That's a weird reason to babysit a stranger in an ICU. I've had worse reasons to do things." She was quiet for a while. Her eyes tracked to the bag again. The habit of it was automatic, like breathing. "The bag," she finally said. "I need you to understand something about it before anyone else gets near it." "Okay." "It's not medical supplies." She paused. "Let that sit. Whatever anyone assumes about me, combat nurse, maritime casualty, wrong place, wrong time, that bag is the reason I was on that aircraft. It's the reason I went into the water. And it's the reason I'm going to be very difficult to protect once the wrong people confirm I made it here." Hale set down the coffee. "What's in it?" She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes. "Enough to end careers," she said. "Enough to open investigations that certain people have been paying a lot of money to keep closed. Enough that 3 years ago, when I first started putting it together, I understood I would eventually run out of options except to run. And now I'm out of ocean to run into." By morning, the news of the survivor had reached 3 different people who should not have known about it at all. The first was a logistics coordinator at a defense company called Praxis Meridian Group, who received an encrypted alert on a secondary device and immediately forwarded it up the chain. The second was a man named Victor Strand, who sat at the top of that chain. He read the alert in the back of a car somewhere between Dulles Airport and a meeting that was now going to have to be rescheduled. He read it twice. Then he told the driver to pull over and made a phone call that lasted less than 90 seconds. The third person to learn Rachel Voss was alive was a military intelligence analyst named Sergeant First Class Iris Vance, who worked a desk at a regional signals facility and had been quietly, carefully documenting the communication patterns of Victor Strand's network for the better part of 18 months. When the encrypted alert moved through one of the nodes she was monitoring, she sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up a phone that was not her work phone and called a number she had been told to use only in an emergency. Hale was in the hallway outside the ICU when his secure line buzzed. Unknown routing. He almost let it go to voicemail. He didn't. Commander Hale! The voice on the other end was female, clipped, and clearly running on adrenaline. You don't know me. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound like a significant overreach from a non-commissioned officer, so I'll keep it brief. The woman you pulled out of the North Atlantic this morning, don't let anyone access her or her belongings until you can verify chain of command on whoever comes asking. And I mean anyone. That includes people with rank on their collar. Hale stood very still. Who is this? Someone who's been watching the network that wanted her dead. Can you give me something to verify that? A pause. Then, she has a scar on her left forearm, 3 inches parallel to the radius. She got it in a field surgery during an op in Eastern Africa that doesn't appear in any official record. If she trusts you enough, she'll show it to you. The call disconnected. Hale looked at his phone for a moment, then he walked back into the ICU. Rachel was awake, sitting up slightly. She'd managed to get a small amount of water down on her own, which the nursing staff treated as a victory proportional to its actual difficulty. I need to ask you something, Hale said. She waited. Your left forearm. Something shifted behind her eyes, fast, almost imperceptible. But it was there. She pulled back the sleeve of the hospital gown without saying anything. 3 inches. Parallel to the radius. Someone just called me, he said. Someone watching the network that knows you survived. She told me not to let anyone near you without verifying chain of command. Rachel's expression didn't change, but her hand moved slightly, the way it always did, toward the bag. Iris, she said quietly, you know her? She's been running parallel surveillance on the same network I've been documenting. We've never met in person. Rachel looked toward the window. Gray Nova Scotia morning, clouds moving fast. If she's calling you directly, it means the alert went further than I hoped. It means Strand already knows. Victor Strand. He runs Praxis Meridian Group. Defense contractor, officially. Unofficially, she stopped, pressed her lips together. What I have in that bag is his unofficial biography. Hale pulled the chair closer, sat down. You need to tell me what you're dealing with so I know how to help you. I need to know if you're serious about that before I tell you anything. I turned the aircraft around when every survival metric said there was nothing alive in that water. I've been sitting in this chair for 12 hours. I think I'm serious. For the first time since he'd pulled her out of the Atlantic, Rachel Voss almost smiled. It was crooked and exhausted and nowhere near warm, but it was real. Victor Strand has been running illegal covert operation contracts through Praxis for at least 7 years, she said. Ops that went off the books because the official channels wouldn't sanction them, because they involved civilian casualties, illegal intelligence gathering, and in at least 3 cases, the deliberate elimination of people who were about to talk to oversight bodies. She paused. I was attached to special operations units for 4 of those years, as a combat nurse. I was in the rooms, I saw the aftermath. I started documenting when I realized no one else was going to. Why not go through official channels? She gave him a look that wasn't quite contempt, more like exhausted patience. Because the official channels had Strand's people in them. 3 separate times I tried to escalate internally. Twice I was reassigned within 72 hours. The third time, my supervisor's supervisor called me into a room and told me very directly that I was suffering from post-deployment stress and should consider taking leave. A beat. The next week, the sergeant I'd been comparing notes with had a car accident. He survived, but he stopped returning my calls. The room was very quiet. "So you built a case?" Hale said. "For 3 years. Everything I could get my hands on. Communication records, financial trails, mission logs that were supposed to have been destroyed, witness accounts I took myself, chain of custody documentation." She glanced at the bag. "All of it is in there. Encrypted. Multiple redundant copies on the drives inside. And the flight you were on was not accidental." Her voice was flat. "I'd been running for 6 weeks. New identities, cash only, never more than 3 days in one place. I thought I had a clean routing. Clearly I didn't." She paused. "The crash was staged. They caused it. I went into the water and I held on to that bag and I just..." She stopped, looked at the ceiling. Something moved through her face that wasn't exactly emotion, more like the memory of a physical sensation. "I just didn't let go." Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who else knows you're here besides the people who want to find you?" "Now? Iris Vance. You. Whoever on your crew was present for the extraction." She paused. "And within the next 24 hours, almost certainly Victor Strand's people. Then we need to move before that window closes." Rachel looked at him. The steadiness in her eyes was something that had clearly cost her a significant amount of effort to maintain, and it didn't waver. "Why are you doing this? I'm a stranger you pulled out of the ocean. This isn't your problem." Hale thought about the satellite feed, the debris field, the arm pointing at the sky. "Someone put you in that water," he said. "I'm not going to let them finish what they started." Rachel held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached for the bag. "Then you need to know everything," she said, starting from the beginning. What she told him over the next 2 hours remade his understanding of what he'd stumbled into. Rachel Voss had joined the Army at 19, finished nursing school on a military scholarship, and spent the next decade in roles that steadily migrated from conventional medical support to something considerably less visible. She'd been attached to special operations units in 4 different theaters. She'd worked under cover designations that didn't appear in her official service record. She'd done things she described without embellishment and without particular pride, simply as a record of what had happened and what it had cost. She was not the person he'd assumed she was. Not because she'd hidden it, more because the assumption itself had been lazy, combat nurse. The words had conjured a specific image: competent, dedicated, subordinate, someone who moved through the machinery of military operations and kept the pieces running, not someone who watched that machinery and made records of where it was broken, not someone who spent 3 years building a case that could dismantle careers at the highest levels of the defense establishment. "You never thought about stopping," he said at one point. Not a question exactly. She considered it honestly. "Once, about 18 months in, after they reassigned me the second time." A pause. "I spent about a week thinking about what it would look like to just walk away. Get out. Become a civilian nurse somewhere quiet and pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen." "What stopped you?" "I pulled the names of the civilian casualties from a mission log I shouldn't have had access to." Her voice was level. "Some of them were aid workers. 2 of them were translators who'd worked with American forces for years. There was a woman in her 50s whose only apparent connection to anything was that she'd talked to an investigative journalist 3 weeks before she died." A beat. "You can't unsee a list like that." Hale didn't say anything. "I'm not a hero," Rachel added, with the directness of someone who had thought about this and arrived somewhere honest. "I made a lot of mistakes building this case. I trusted people I shouldn't have. I moved too slow in some places and too fast in others. I got people hurt by getting them adjacent to what I was doing." She paused. "I just kept going because stopping felt worse." The call Hale had been dreading came at 0947. It was routed through Ironcliff's official command line. An administrative inquiry from the office of Brigadier General Wallace Pruitt requesting immediate information on the civilian survivor currently admitted to the facility. The inquiry was framed as routine. standard protocol for any potential civilian casualty of a maritime incident within the military's SAR jurisdiction. The language was correct. The authority appeared legitimate. The timing was not coincidental. Hale took the call himself from the nurse's station, keeping his voice neutral and his answers minimal. He confirmed that a survivor was in the facility. He confirmed she was receiving treatment. He did not confirm her identity. He did not confirm the status of her personal belongings. When the call ended, he stood with the receiver in his hand for a moment. Then he went back to Rachel's room. "Someone just put an administrative inquiry through official channels," he said. "Framed as routine. Timing is wrong." Rachel didn't look surprised. "Pruitt?" His eyes narrowed. "You know that name?" "It's in the bag." She sat up straighter, wincing slightly at the effort. Her color was better than it had been, but she was still running on something below empty. Wallace Pruitt. He's one of 4 flag officers whose names appear across multiple Praxis Meridian operations. He's not the top, he's a facilitator, but he's connected to Strand's network, and he'll be one of the first people Strand notifies. If they're already moving through official channels, we have less time than I thought. "We have hours," Rachel said. "Maybe less." Hale looked at her, then at the bag. "Can you walk?" he asked. She swung her legs off the bed. The effort was visible. Her jaw tightened and her hands gripped the rail. But she didn't stop. She stood there for a moment, finding her balance. Then she picked up the bag. "Where are we going?" she said. Hale pulled out his phone and sent a text to the only 2 people in the facility he was absolutely certain he could trust. "Somewhere they won't think to look yet," he said. "And then I'm going to need you to tell me exactly what's on those drives." Rachel's hand tightened on the strap of the bag. Somewhere in the hospital, a door opened that shouldn't have opened at that hour. Footsteps moved in the hallway outside. Wrong cadence. Wrong direction. Hale heard it. Rachel heard it. She looked at him. "They're already here," she said. The footsteps stopped. That was almost worse. Moving footsteps meant someone going somewhere with a purpose. Stopped footsteps meant someone listening, waiting, calculating how much they already knew about what was on the other side of a door. Hale put one hand out. Not grabbing Rachel, just a flat palm in the air between them. "Stay." She was already still. She'd gone completely, professionally still the moment she heard it. The kind of stillness that wasn't fear, but something older and more disciplined than that. He moved to the door and looked through the narrow observation window. A man in green orderly scrubs stood in the hallway approximately 12 feet away, facing a supply cart he was not using. He was too still. His hands were on the cart's handlebar in the exact position of someone who wanted their hands to appear occupied. The scrubs were correct. The ID badge clipped to his breast pocket looked correct. His shoes were not correct. They were low-profile tactical lace-ups, black, with the slight squared toe that came from a particular kind of reinforced cap, the kind that showed up in gear catalogs that didn't have civilian distribution. Hale let the door fall shut without a sound. He turned to Rachel, held up one finger. She nodded. 1. He sent a text to the 2 people he'd already messaged. "Now. Side corridor, B-wing, service elevator. Don't use the main hall." Then he crossed to the room's secondary door, the one that connected to a utility corridor most of the floor staff used for linen transfers and equipment movement. He tried the handle. Unlocked. He looked back at Rachel. She had the bag over one shoulder and her hospital gown was frankly absurd for what was happening, but there was nothing to do about that. Her feet were bare. That was also a problem. She followed his eyes down to her feet, then back up. "I've moved through worse," she said, almost inaudibly. He believed her. The service elevator was 40 feet down the utility corridor, past 2 linen carts and a broken IV stand that someone had propped against the wall with optimistic intention and apparently forgotten. The fluorescent light above the second cart was cycling through a slow, arrhythmic flicker that made the whole corridor feel faintly wrong. Hale moved fast. Rachel moved beside him and slightly behind, adjusting her pace to his without being told to, reading the geometry of the space the way someone did when moving through a building had been, at some point in their life, a matter of survival rather than convenience. They were 10 feet from the elevator when a door at the far end of the corridor opened. different man. Same shoes. He saw them at the same moment they saw him. There was a half second where everyone processed what they were looking at, and then the man's right hand moved toward his side. Hale was already moving. He covered the distance faster than the man clearly expected. People saw a SAR pilot in a flight suit and did not immediately calculate threat, and hit him hard enough to drive him back into the doorframe. The man was solid and recovered fast, but Hale had leverage and was angry in a specific, focused way that tended to be more useful in a close-quarters situation than size alone. 2 seconds. The man went down, conscious but not coordinated, and Hale was already turning back. Rachel was at the elevator, pressing the call button. Her expression was focused, not panicked, not impressed, just working the problem. "There'll be more," she said when he reached her. "I know. They don't leave two at an entry point." "I know." The elevator doors opened. They got in. Hale hit the basement level button and then, as the doors closed, stood with his back to the wall and breathed. His hand was going to bruise. He looked at it and then looked away. "You've done that before," Rachel said. Not a question. "Occasionally." The guy in the scrubs by the supply cart was watching the room. The one in the corridor was watching the exit point. She was thinking out loud, her voice low. Two-person containment on a single target means they're not authorized for a hard extraction yet. They're in observation and delay mode, waiting for confirmation or a call sign. How long do we have before they move to the next phase? Depends on who gave the order and how risk-averse they're feeling. She paused. Victor Strand is very risk-averse in places where he can't control the narrative. A hospital is messy, witnesses, security cameras. He'd want this done quietly. Another pause. Which means we have a window, but it's closing. The elevator hit the basement and the doors opened onto a service area that smelled of industrial cleaning products and recycled air. Hale's contacts were waiting. Petty Officer First Class Damara Kroll, his crew medic, and Master Chief Garrett Obi, who ran the base's logistics coordination and had, on 3 separate occasions, demonstrated the particular gift of making problems disappear without paperwork. Kroll took one look at Rachel's bare feet and the hospital gown and turned immediately to Obi. "Tell me you have the bag." Obi produced a drawstring bag from behind a supply shelf. Inside, a pair of worn but intact trail runners in approximately the right size, a pair of cargo pants, a thermal underlayer, and a fleece. "Best I could do in 40 minutes, he said. Rachel took the bag without comment and turned away to change. She did it fast, the efficiency of someone who dressed in worse conditions and didn't attach ceremony to the process. 30 seconds. When she turned back around, she looked like a different person. The hospital gown had been doing something to her, making her look like a patient, like a victim of something. The clothes changed the register entirely. Kroll handed her a pair of socks and she sat on the edge of a shelving unit and put them on. "How bad is it upstairs?" Obi asked. "2 confirmed," Hale said. "More likely, Strand's people." Obi absorbed this without visible reaction. "Do we know what Strand's people look like?" "Wrong shoes," Hale said. "So, right clothes, wrong shoes." Obi nodded like this was a perfectly reasonable identification methodology. They moved Rachel to a storage room in the basement's secondary wing, technically a decommissioned mechanical space that hadn't been used for its original purpose in 6 years, and now mostly housed outdated equipment waiting for disposal. Obi had cleared a section of it 2 hours ago under the pretense of an inventory audit. It wasn't comfortable, but it had 2 points of entry, no interior surveillance, and no reason for anyone to wander into it without specific purpose. Rachel sat on an overturned equipment case, and Hale finally asked the question he'd been holding back. "The bag. I need to understand what we're actually protecting." She set it on her knees. For a moment, she just looked at it, this battered, waterproof, salt-stained thing that had been in the North Atlantic and come out the other side. Then she unzipped the outer layer and pulled back the interior lining to reveal a secondary compartment built into the base. It wasn't visible from the outside. The lining material matched exactly. The seam was invisible unless you knew where to press. Inside the compartment, 4 drives, each sealed in individual waterproof cases, a slim encrypted tablet, 2 external authentication tokens, a folded document set in a sealed plastic sleeve. The drives contain the full case, she said. 7 years of documentation, financial records showing payment flows between Praxis Meridian and a network of shell accounts, communication intercepts. Some of them obtained through channels that aren't strictly legal, which is part of why I could never just hand this to a JAG officer and call it done. Mission logs from operations that were either falsified or destroyed in official records, but which I reconstructed from source testimony and physical documentation gathered on site. She touched the tablet case. The tablet has the index and the authentication trail. Everything is time-stamped, cross-referenced, and tied to independent corroboration where I could get it. How many names? In terms of direct involvement, 11. In terms of people who knew and chose to look away, closer to 30. She paused. The 11 include 2 active duty general officers, 3 defense executives at Praxis, and 2 of its subsidiaries, 4 intelligence officials at the department level, and Victor Strand himself. The room was very quiet. Damara Kroll, who had been standing near the door, said, "This is the part where someone tells me we're in over our heads." "We're in over our heads," Obi said without particular alarm. "Okay, just wanted it acknowledged." Rachel looked at Kroll. Something almost like appreciation crossed her face, brief and tired. "The case is solid. That's what 3 years bought. If the right people get access to these files, the documentation is strong enough to sustain a federal prosecution, maybe several." She looked at Hale. "The problem is getting them to the right people without Strand's network intercepting the handoff." "Who are the right people?" "Independent federal prosecutor. Someone without military ties, without any connection to defense contracting, with subpoena authority and the standing to initiate criminal referrals." She paused. "I had a name. An attorney out of the DOJ's Independent Oversight Division. Her name is Margot Fielding. She's been building a reputation for taking on cases that more senior officials prefer to ignore." "You've been in contact with her?" "I tried, twice, through intermediaries. The first attempt didn't reach her. The second might have. I never got confirmation before I had to run." Rachel's jaw tightened. "What I don't know is whether Strand's network has people inside Fielding's office. If they do, contacting her directly could tip them off before the files are secured." Hale thought about this. "So we need to move the files to Fielding without going through any channel that Strand's people might be monitoring." "Yes. And we need to do it before they finish tightening the net around this building." "Yes." "Any ideas?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she reached back into the bag and produced a small folded paper from the document sleeve. Handwritten, a series of numbers and a partial address. Iris Vance. She's been running parallel surveillance on the same network for 18 months. She's not military intelligence. She's a civilian contractor working under military cover, which means her communication channels aren't the same as the ones Strand's people have access to. If she can establish a secure routing to Fielding's office, the files could move through her network instead of mine. "And you trust her?" Rachel looked at the folded paper. "She called you when she didn't have to. She knew about the scar." A pause. "Yes, I trust her." "Okay." Hale stood. "Then I need to make a call." What happened next took 4 hours and operated on the particular logic of improvised situations where every option has a flaw and the goal is to find the flaw you can live with. Obi reached Iris Vance through a routing that involved 2 prepaid devices and a relay he refused to fully explain, on the grounds that explaining it would take longer than using it. The call lasted 8 minutes. When Obi came back into the storage room, his expression was carefully neutral. "She's in," he said. "She can establish a secure channel to Fielding's office, but she needs 24 hours to set up the routing cleanly enough that it can't be traced back to the transfer point." 24 hours, Hale said. "That's what she said." Rachel looked at the ceiling. "We don't have 24 hours in this building." "No," Hale agreed, "which means we need to move you before Strand's people get authorization to stop being polite about it." "Where?" This was the question Hale had been working on for the last 90 minutes with a portion of his attention while the other portion was on the immediate problem. Ironcliff had a secondary facility, a small, detached outbuilding used for quarantine protocols, officially under medical jurisdiction but physically separate from the main building and staffed only during active quarantine situations. It had its own entrance, its own generator, and its own exterior security camera system that ran on a separate circuit from the main hospital network. It also had a medical records designation that would allow Hale to move Rachel there under the cover of isolation protocol. An unusual, but not unprecedented, administrative action for a patient whose status was complicated. It buys us time, Kroll said when he outlined it. Not the same as solving the problem. Time is what we need right now. The transfer itself is the vulnerable moment, Rachel said. If they have people watching the exterior, moving me from this building to that one gives them an opportunity. I know. Hale looked at Obi. How many of Strand's people do you think are on site? Obi tilted his head. Based on the two you encountered, the access timing, and the fact that they're still in observation mode, I'd estimate 4 to 6, small enough to avoid drawing attention, large enough to cover the exits. Can we create a distraction? Obi looked at him with the particular expression of a man who had spent 20 years solving logistical problems and found the question mildly offensive. Yes, he said simply. The distraction was unglamorous and effective. Obi triggered a malfunctioning HVAC alarm in the east wing of the main building, not a fire alarm which would require full evacuation protocol and official response, but a low-grade environmental alert that required facilities staff to investigate and that would draw the attention of anyone stationed near the east wing exits toward the commotion of people moving purposefully in the wrong direction. It bought them 6 minutes. Kroll moved with Rachel through the service exit while Hale went in the opposite direction through the main corridor, visible and unhurried, giving anyone watching a reason to keep eyes on him rather than the service door. He walked to the nurse's station, asked a pointless question about the ICU access log, and stood there for 4 minutes making a conversation he didn't care about while Kroll and Rachel crossed the exterior path to the quarantine building. When his phone buzzed, Kroll's signal, 2 pulses, he ended the conversation and walked away. He checked the hallway behind him. The man in the wrong shoes was no longer at the supply cart. Otet. The quarantine building was small and smelled of disinfectant and sealed air. It had 4 rooms, a small nursing station, and a supply closet that Kroll had already converted into something closer to a functional monitoring space. The windows were high and narrow. The main door locked from the inside with a physical bolt in addition to the electronic keypad. Rachel sat at the edge of one of the beds and put the bag on the floor beside her feet and did not let go of the strap. She had not let go of the strap in approximately 18 hours. Hale noticed this in the way you notice things you're not supposed to comment on. You need to sleep, he said. I know. Kroll will stay. I need to make contact with someone on the outside. Someone who can run interference with Pruitt's inquiry and buy us the time Iris needs to set up the channel. Rachel looked up. Who? Colonel Nadia Reyes. She's the base's legal affairs officer. She's been here 7 years and she doesn't like Pruitt on a personal level, which is not the same as being trustworthy, but it's a data point. He paused. She also has the authority to formally challenge the administrative inquiry on procedural grounds, which slows the paperwork without tipping anyone off that we're doing anything other than being bureaucratically difficult. Do you trust her? I trust that she hates being outmaneuvered by people who think administrative authority gives them access to things they haven't properly requested. Rachel considered this. That's a different thing than trusting her. Yes, but it might be enough for what I need her to do. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the bag. Hale. Her voice was quieter than usual. I need you to understand something. If this goes wrong, if Strand's people get to those drives before Iris can establish the channel, everything I've spent 3 years building disappears. Not just gets delayed. Disappears. People with enough resources to make evidence cease to exist have a different relationship to the concept of permanence than most. She paused. So I need you to think very carefully about who you bring into this and what you tell them. I understand. I don't think you do entirely. She wasn't being unkind. You're a good man who pulled a stranger out of the ocean and made a judgment call. That's a different set of stakes than what I've been operating in. Hale sat down across from her, looked at her directly. Tell me about one of the people on that list. One of the civilian casualties. Not a summary. The actual person. Rachel went still. You told me about the list earlier, he said. The aid workers, the translators, the woman who talked to a journalist. He paused. Tell me about one of them specifically, so I understand what we're protecting. She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. Then, there was a man named Aldous Ferris. He was 39. He worked for an international medical aid organization. He was a logistics coordinator, not a field worker. He was in a region where Praxis Meridian was running a black site intelligence operation that had gone off the books 6 months earlier. She paused. He wasn't a threat. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he had the misfortune of being someone whose work required him to document supply movements in and out of a certain area. He'd filed 3 routine reports to his organization. 2 of those reports contained information that, if someone in the right oversight body had read them carefully, would have raised questions about what was being moved through the region. She stopped. Her hands were loose in her lap. He was found in his vehicle 4 miles from the aid station. The official report said cardiac event. He was 39, and his organization's medical records showed no prior cardiac history. A beat. His name is in the bag. So is the testimony I collected from 2 people who were there. The room was very quiet. I understand, Hale said. This time, she didn't argue. Nah. Colonel Nadia Reyes was in her office when Hale knocked at 1400 hours. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with very short silver hair and the kind of posture that came from spending decades being the most prepared person in whatever room she walked into. She looked at him when he entered, and then at the door he'd closed behind him, and her expression said she had already started calculating. This isn't a routine visit, she said. No, ma'am. The inquiry from Pruitt's office. Yes, ma'am. She leaned back slightly. Sit down, Commander. He sat. He told her what he could tell her without disclosing Rachel's full situation, enough to establish that the inquiry was not routine, that the patient in question had reason to believe she was at risk, and that a premature disclosure of her status to Pruitt's office could have consequences that went beyond the hospital's jurisdiction. He did not mention Strand. He did not mention the bag. He mentioned the shoes. Reyes listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at her desk for a moment. You're asking me to challenge the inquiry on procedural grounds. Yes, ma'am. Specifically, the disclosure requirements for a patient admitted under maritime casualty protocol. There's a 72-hour window before external administrative requests have mandatory compliance standing. I know the protocol, Commander. I wrote the implementation guidance for it in 2019. She looked at him. What you're describing, men in the wrong shoes, a patient who believes she's being hunted, an administrative inquiry with suspicious timing. You know what that sounds like. Yes, ma'am. You know what it could mean for your career if you're wrong. Yes, ma'am. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up a pen and pulled a legal pad toward her with the deliberate movement of someone who had made a decision and was already thinking about implementation. The inquiry has procedural deficiencies, she said. It's missing 2 required certification signatures, and the request category was filed incorrectly for a maritime casualty admission. I can return it for correction, which kicks the timeline back by at least 48 hours. That's enough time. For what? Hale met her eyes. I can't tell you that yet. Reyes looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote something on the pad and tore off the sheet and slid it across the desk. A name and a direct number. When you can tell someone, she said, tell that person. He looked at the name. Margot Fielding, the same name Rachel had given him 6 hours ago. He looked up. I've been watching Pruitt's administrative behavior for 2 years, Reyes said flatly. I've been waiting for something specific enough to act on. She picked up her pen again. Don't waste the 48 hours. By 1800 hours, the quarantine building was quiet. Kroll was monitoring the single exterior camera feed from the nursing station. Obi had done a perimeter check and reported that 2 of Strand's people appeared to have repositioned to the east side of the main building. Still present, still watching, but the perimeter coverage had thinned slightly, which either meant they'd pulled resources for another purpose, or they'd lost track of exactly where Rachel had moved to. Neither option was entirely reassuring. Rachel was awake despite Hale's earlier suggestion. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed with the tablet from the bag open on her knees. scrolling through something with the focused expression of a person reviewing their own work for errors. She did this, Hale had observed, the way a surgeon might review imaging before an operation. Not anxiously, just rigorously. Reyes had Fielding's name, he said from the doorway. Rachel looked up. Something in her face shifted. She's been watching. 2 years, she said. Then the network is more visible than Strand thinks it is. She closed the tablet. That's either very good or very dangerous, depending on how many other people have been watching without acting. Iris needs until tomorrow morning to establish the channel. Reyes bought us 48 hours on the inquiry. He paused. We're going to be okay tonight. Rachel looked at him with an expression that was impossible to fully read. Not disbelief exactly, more like someone who had learned through specific and painful experience to hold the word okay at arm's length. One of Strand's people is a woman named Lena Firth, she said suddenly. She's in his operations management layer, former intelligence, very good at infiltration. She doesn't show up on the first layer of the documentation. She's 3 levels in. She paused. I don't know if she's one of the people here right now, but if she is, she's not going to wait for authorization in the same way the others might. She operates on her own timeline. Hale filed this. What does she look like? Rachel described her. Then she paused. There's something else. About the drives. She reached into the bag and produced one of the 4 sealed cases. This one contains everything. The others contain partial sets, deliberately overlapping. I did that so that if 1 or 2 drives were intercepted, it wouldn't kill the case. But it would also mean whoever intercepted them would think they had the full picture when they didn't. She held the drive case for a moment. This one is different because it also contains something I didn't include in my description to you earlier. A second tier of documentation that goes beyond Praxis Meridian. He went still. A separate financial network, she said. Smaller, more recent. The money coming out of it is moving into political channels, campaign-adjacent organizations, lobbying infrastructure, some of it into media. I started finding it about 8 months ago, and I spent the last 5 months tracing it. She looked at the drive. It's connected to Strand, but it's a different structure, different purpose. If the Praxis operation is about concealing what they've already done, this second network is about buying protection for what they're planning to do next. Hale sat down on the edge of the second bed. The fluorescent light above them hummed faintly. Outside, the Nova Scotia wind moved against the building with quiet persistence. How far up does it go? He asked. Rachel looked at the drive in her hand. Far enough, she said, that when I realized what I was looking at, I stopped telling anyone I was still alive. Before either of them could say anything else, Kroll's voice came through the door, low, controlled, with the particular flatness of someone delivering information they would rather not be delivering. We have a problem. Camera 3 just went dark. East side exterior. Hale was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Cameras didn't go dark on their own at 1800 hours on a clear evening. They went dark when someone needed a blind spot. Hale moved to the nursing station in 4 steps and looked at the monitor bank. Camera 3 was static. Not cycling, not glitching, just flat gray, the specific absence of signal that meant a physical disconnection rather than a system error. Someone had pulled the cable or covered the lens. Either way, they'd done it deliberately, and they'd done it on the east side, which was the building's shortest approach to the quarantine unit's secondary entrance. Kroll was already at the door, her hand on the bolt. I count maybe 90 seconds before whoever killed that camera reaches the door. Don't open it, Hale said. I wasn't planning to. Rachel came out of the room with the bag. She had it the way she always had it. Over one shoulder, strap crossed, hand on the main compartment. She looked at the monitor bank, did the same rapid calculation Hale had done, and looked at him. Secondary entrance, east wall. They'll try the handle first. Then the hinges, Kroll said. Then something louder. Rachel's voice was flat. How thick are these walls? Medical construction. Concrete block, probably 8 inches. Hale looked around the space with the specific focus of someone turning a room into a problem to be solved. The quarantine building had been designed to keep people in, not to keep people out. Not the same thing, but some of the structural logic overlapped. The internal doors were solid core. The main entrance had the physical bolt Kroll had noted earlier. The secondary entrance on the east wall was the weak point. He texted Obi. East camera dark. Possible breach, secondary entrance. Where are you? The response came back in 40 seconds. Parking structure, north side. Can reach you in 4 minutes. 4 minutes was too long and not long enough depending on what happened in the next 90 seconds. We don't move, Rachel said. Moving now is what they want. The moment we're outside this building, we're exposed in open space with no cover and no route they haven't already calculated. She looked at Hale. They want us to run. This isn't a breach, it's a flush. He understood immediately. A camera kill on the east side pushed the obvious evacuation route to the west. Through the main building, through exactly the kind of busy, complicated space where two people with the wrong shoes could create a mess that looked like an accident and be gone before anyone organized a response. They're going to push us toward the main building, he said. Yes. So we stay. We stay, and we make this room harder than they expected it to be. She looked at Kroll. What's in the supply closet? Kroll had already turned toward it. She pulled it open and stood there for a second, reading the shelves with clinical speed. Quarantine medical supplies, so it's mostly PPE, sealed biohazard packaging, some basic diagnostic equipment, and then, because medical facilities kept them in quarantine units specifically for scenarios where a patient needed to be restrained for their own safety, 2 full rolls of 4-inch medical-grade restraint strapping, a roll of heavy-duty equipment tape, and a portable IV pole with a weighted base. Not weapons, but adaptable. Rachel was already moving to the secondary door. She examined the hinge configuration, the door frame, the gap between the door's edge and the frame. The bolt on this one is internal, but it's a slide bolt, not a deadbolt. 2 people hitting it with a solid object will pop the frame in under 30 seconds. She looked at the IV pole. We wedge this under the handle at an angle. Base against the floor, pole at 45 degrees. It won't stop them, but it buys us another 15 to 20 seconds per attempt. Kroll brought the pole. Hale positioned it. It wasn't elegant, and it wouldn't hold against serious force, but Rachel was right. It added friction to the timeline, and right now the timeline was everything. Then they heard it. Not a handle test, not a knock, a voice. Female, low, carrying clearly through the door's edge gap. Rachel, I know you're in there. I know you're with the pilot. I want you to know this doesn't have to be a difficult situation. Rachel went completely still. Hale looked at her. She held up one finger. Wait. The documentation you've collected is already known to us, the voice continued. What you may not realize is that there are aspects of the case you've built that are based on incomplete information, things you saw without the context to understand them correctly. A pause. The voice was professionally calm, not taunting, not threatening, almost reasonable. I'm not here to destroy what you've built. I'm here to have a conversation about what it actually means. Kroll leaned close to Hale. Firth, she mouthed. He didn't know who Kroll had told, but yes, this had to be Lena Firth. Rachel had been right. Rachel moved quietly to the door, stood 6 inches from it. When she spoke, her voice carried the same professional calm as the woman outside, and it was not a coincidence. Lena, she said, you've been running Strand's field operations for 4 years. Your name appears in my documentation 41 times. The suggestion that I've misunderstood what I've documented is not a conversation I'm interested in having. A pause on the other side. You know who I am, Firth said. I've known for 14 months. Another pause. Longer this time. Hale could hear in the silence the small recalibration happening on the other side of the door. Firth adjusting her model of what she was dealing with, which was not a frightened former nurse clinging to files she didn't fully understand, but something considerably different. Then you know I can make a call, Firth said, and this gets much less civil within the next few minutes. Make it, Rachel said. And watch what happens to the case documentation before your people get through that door. Silence. It was a bluff. Partially. The documentation wasn't transmitting yet. Iris Vance still needed until morning to establish the secure channel. But Firth didn't know that. And the 41 entries in the documentation that named her specifically gave her a very particular reason to want this handled quietly rather than through escalation. Hale's phone buzzed. Obi. 2 minutes out. And I brought company. How many on site? Hale typed back. Unknown. At least one confirmed at secondary entrance, possibly more on west approach. Obi's response: west approach is clear. I'm looking at it right now. Which meant the operation was smaller than Rachel had estimated. Firth was here with a limited team, probably 2 or 3 people, not 6. The camera kill had been tactical misdirection rather than the opening move of a full hard extraction team. That told Hale something. Strand hadn't authorized a full operation. This was Firth operating on her own initiative, trying to contain the situation before it required escalating to Strand, which meant even within the network that was hunting Rachel, there were people making independent decisions, managing their own exposure, operating slightly outside the chain of command. It also meant Firth had more reason to keep this quiet than to make it loud. He looked at Rachel, touched his phone, held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes. She nodded fractionally. Lena, she said through the door. You're running a personal operation right now, not an authorized one. Strand doesn't know you're here with this approach, or this would look different. A beat. I've spent 3 years watching how this network operates. Authorized operations come with more people and fewer conversations through closed doors. The silence on the other side was different this time. Hale could hear it, the specific quality of someone deciding how honest to be. What I want, Firth finally said, is the second tier, the political network, not the praxis operation. That's already too distributed to fully contain. Another pause. Give me the second tier documentation and I walk away from this building. Rachel looked at Hale. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, something more complicated than that. Confirmation, maybe. The particular feeling of a theory that had been abstract for a long time making contact with reality. She's not here for Strand, Rachel said quietly, too low for the door. She's here for whoever Strand is working for. Hale processed this in silence. The second tier, Rachel said, at the door again. The political network. Yes. You want it because your name is in it. The pause was exactly 1 second too long. I want it because it's the most destructive piece of what you've built. Same answer, Rachel said. Then she stepped back from the door, done with the conversation. She looked at Hale and her face had the focused composure of someone who had moved past options and arrived at a plan. When Obi gets here, we secure Firth and whoever she brought. We don't let them leave the perimeter. Firth in particular, if she walks away from this building with what she knows about the second tier, she will find a way to destroy it before the channel goes live. Detaining her creates a different set of legal complications. I know. Rachel's jaw tightened. I know it does. But the alternative is worse. It was the kind of impossible arithmetic that didn't have a clean answer. And that was the reality of it, not a story problem with a solution at the back of the book. There was no version of the next 6 hours that didn't cost something. The question was what they could afford to lose. Obi's arrival was not subtle, which was, it turned out, entirely intentional. He came through the main entrance with 2 MPs from the base's security detail, not Ironcliff's internal security staff, who were civilian contractors, but actual military police who had been roused by a formal request from Colonel Reyes citing an unresolved security anomaly on the facility's exterior perimeter. The request had gone through proper channels. The response was therefore entirely authorized. Firth heard them before she saw them. Hale heard it through the door. Footsteps. A sharp change in cadence. The particular sound of someone reassessing their position quickly. She's going to run, Kroll said. Rachel was at the door. She drew the bolt, moved the IV pole, and opened it in one sequence before Hale could tell her not to. Cold November air hit the room. The east side exterior was a narrow concrete apron between the quarantine building and the perimeter fence. 2 people were visible, a man in dark clothing moving rapidly toward the fence's far corner, and Lena Firth, who had stopped moving. She was standing 6 feet from the door, looking at Rachel Voss across the cold gap between them. She was younger than Hale had expected, mid-40s, lean, with the particular economy of movement that came from a specific kind of training. Her hands were visible and empty. She looked at Rachel the way people sometimes looked at things they'd spent a long time theorizing about, and were now confronting as a concrete physical fact. You look better than I expected, Firth said, given what the Atlantic apparently did to you. You look exactly like I expected, Rachel said. given what 41 entries in a case file does to how you imagine someone. The MPs were rounding the corner. The man who'd been moving toward the fence stopped when he saw them, went very still for a moment, and then apparently made a decision that preserved his freedom of movement over his assignment, because he kept going, over the fence, gone into the dark. Firth didn't run. Hale read that correctly. She had calculated that running made everything worse for her specifically, and she was right. "I'll need legal representation," she said to no one in particular. "You'll get it," Hale said. Obi was already coordinating with the MPs, who were doing their job with the methodical efficiency of people who had been given clear authorization and a specific task, and were not confused about either. Firth was not physically restrained. Well, she wasn't resisting, but she was not going anywhere. Rachel watched from the doorway. She had the bag. She always had the bag. One of the MPs, a young sergeant named Okafor, who looked barely old enough to be doing this job, glanced at Rachel and then quickly looked away in the manner of someone who had registered something about her that didn't fit the category he'd expected. The situation in the exterior was controlled. The immediate threat was contained. Firth's partner was gone, which was a problem for later. Firth herself was here, which meant the second tier of documentation, the political network, was now a known quantity to the people who could act on it. The crisis had not ended. Crises like this one didn't end in a single moment, but the shape of it had changed. Hale stood beside Rachel in the doorway. The November wind moved through the space between buildings. The exterior lights cast everything in that particular harsh sodium clarity of institutional outdoor lighting, flat and honest, and not kind to anyone. "The channel goes live in the morning," he said. "Yes." "Can you hold on until morning?" Rachel looked at the bag. Then at Firth, who was standing 20 feet away being processed by Okafor with professional detachment. Then at Hale. She opened her mouth to answer. Her phone, Kroll's spare, which Obi had given her 3 hours ago, buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, looked at the screen. The message was from Iris Vance's relay number. 7 words. "Channel is live. Files are transmitting. Check drive 3. Rachel read it twice. Then she looked at the drive case in the bag's outer pocket, the one she hadn't touched since explaining the second tier. The indicator light on the sealed case was blinking. Green. Active transmission. The drive had been transmitting on its own timer. Rachel had set it herself weeks ago, before she ever boarded the flight that put her in the Atlantic. A failsafe. If she went dark for more than 96 hours, the transmission would initiate automatically through a dormant relay she'd established with Iris 8 months earlier. She had gone dark for 71 hours in the water, plus the time here. The timer had hit its mark. The files were already moving, but Iris's message had a second line, and Rachel read it now with the specific feeling of someone who had just understood that a situation they thought they were managing had grown considerably larger than they knew. "Second tier is bigger than your documentation. I found 3 additional nodes. One of them is current federal legislative branch. You need to see this before it transmits." Rachel looked at the drive. The green light blinked steadily, indifferently, transmitting everything she had built across 3 years into channels she could no longer stop or redirect. Everything was moving, and something she hadn't fully mapped was moving with it. The green light kept blinking. Rachel stood in the doorway of the quarantine building with cold air moving against her face and the drive case in her hand and read Iris's message 3 more times. Not because the words were unclear, but because the implications kept widening every time she reached the end of them. One of them is current federal legislative branch. Not historical, not former, current. She stepped back inside and closed the door. Hale followed her. Kroll was still at the monitor station, but she'd turned to watch them, reading the change in the room the way good medics read changes in a patient, not the surface, the quality underneath. "What is it?" Hale said. Rachel handed him the phone. He read it. His expression didn't collapse into alarm. It did something quieter and more considered than that, which was in some ways harder to watch. He handed the phone back. "How long has the transmission been running?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. The failsafe initialized automatically. It could have been transmitting for up to an hour before Iris detected it and sent the message." Rachel looked at the drive. The green light had not stopped. Everything is already in the channel. I can't pull it back. Do you want to? She thought about that honestly. The instinct was to say no. The whole architecture of the last 3 years had been built toward exactly this moment, files moving into the hands of people who could act on them. Evidence escaping the containment that Strand's network had spent years maintaining. But the second tier was different. The second tier named people she hadn't fully mapped, and those people were in positions where the wrong kind of exposure, premature, incomplete, poorly sequenced, could give them time to respond in ways that buried the case rather than cracked it open. No, she said. But I need to talk to Iris before the channel completes the handoff to Fielding's office. She found 3 additional nodes I didn't have. If those nodes are transmitting with the rest of the documentation, Fielding needs to know they exist and what they are before she opens the files. Can you reach Iris directly? Through the relay, yes. She was already looking at the phone. Give me 10 minutes. Kroll stepped outside to check on Obi and the MPs. Hale stood near the door and kept his attention on the exterior camera feed. Camera 3 was still dark, but cameras 1, 2, and 4 were functioning, and the perimeter looked quiet. Firth had been moved to the base's security holding room inside the main building, walking without resistance and saying nothing beyond her initial request for legal representation, which she'd repeated exactly once and then dropped. The composure of someone playing a longer game. The man who'd gone over the fence had not reappeared. Hale pulled up the contact information for Colonel Reyes and sent her a text that was brief and deliberately ambiguous. Situation contained. New development and scope of evidence. Recommend Fielding be briefed directly before file review. Then he stood with his back to the wall and listened to Rachel's half of the phone conversation through the thin door between rooms. It wasn't much. Short sentences. Long silences where Iris was apparently doing most of the talking. Once Rachel said, "Show me the node structure." And there was a pause and then quietly, "That's a committee chairmanship." Another pause. "Yes, I understand." And then, after the longest silence, "Don't stop the transmission. Just make sure Fielding has the index before she opens the second tier." When she came back out, she looked like someone who had run a very long race and discovered the finish line had been moved. 3 additional nodes, she said. Iris traced them through the financial routing in the second tier. They're not as deeply embedded as Strand's network. They're more recent, and the money flows are smaller but more targeted. Lobbying infrastructure, like I said. But the third node is a sitting member of the Legislative Oversight Committee for Defense Contracting. She paused. The exact committee responsible for reviewing Praxis Meridian's contract renewals. The weight of it settled into the room. So Strand wasn't just buying silence, Hale said. He was buying protection inside the oversight body itself. For at least 2 years, Iris traced the first payment to 18 months ago, which is right around the time one of the Praxis contracts came up for renewal review and passed without the standard audit. Rachel sat on the edge of the nursing station counter. She looked tired in a way that was different from the hypothermia exhaustion. That had been physical. This was something else. I knew the political network existed. I didn't know it had reached the committee level. Does Fielding? She will. Iris is prepping the index summary right now. The full files transmit to Fielding's secure intake in... She checked the phone. Approximately 40 minutes. Then we have 40 minutes before this becomes something Strand knows he can't contain. He probably already knows. Rachel's voice was flat. The transmission would have triggered monitoring alerts on any of the communication channels his network has access to. He can't stop the files from reaching Fielding, but he has 40 minutes to make preparations. Preparations meaning what? Lawyers, document review, preemptive disclosure to allies. Maybe an attempt to negotiate terms through a back channel before federal investigators make that option unavailable. She looked at Hale. Victor Strand did not build a $9 billion operation by being slow to respond to threats. He spent 3 years believing he'd eliminated this threat entirely. Finding out that he failed, that I survived and the case survived, is going to produce a very specific reaction in a man who is fundamentally a contingency planner. Which reaction? He's going to try to get ahead of it, control the narrative, find a way to be the person who brought the problems to light rather than the person who created them. She paused. He's done it before. In 2019, when an internal audit at Praxis flagged 3 irregular contracts, he went directly to the DoD Inspector General before the audit was complete and characterized the contracts as a supplier error that his team had already identified. The IG accepted the framing. The contracts were restructured, not investigated. Her jaw tightened. He's very good at being the one who opens the door before someone kicks it in. Not this time, Hale said. Not if Fielding gets the files first. Hale looked at his watch. 38 minutes. Then we keep everything stable for 38 minutes and let the transmission complete. It was, as plans went, extremely simple. It was also, as Rachel had learned repeatedly over the last 3 years, the simplest plans that found the most creative ways to fall apart. The call came through Reyes at the 20-minute mark, not from Strand. From Brigadier General Wallace Pruitt's office, through official military channels citing a new administrative authority, a temporary evidence hold order signed by a judge in the military's administrative court system, applying specifically to any materials recovered in association with the maritime survival incident admitted to Ironcliff Military Medical Center on the morning of Thursday, November 4th. The order was 3 hours old. It had been filed at 1900 hours, roughly 1 hour after Lena Firth's operation at the quarantine building had failed. Strand had known about the transmission. He'd moved faster than Rachel predicted. Reyes called Hale directly. "I'm looking at this order," she said, without preamble. "It's technically valid. Administrative Military Court has the authority. The hold applies to any evidence currently in the facility." "The files aren't in the facility," Hale said. "They've been transmitting for the last hour. They're in transit." "Then the order needs to specify transmission interception, which requires a different court and a different authorization level, and that process takes longer than—" Reyes paused. "How much longer does the transmission need?" 18 minutes. A beat. "I'm going to call the judge who signed this order and point out the procedural discrepancy between a hold on physical materials and an active digital transmission. That conversation will take at minimum 15 minutes because Judge Hargrove is meticulous and does not like being told he's wrong, even politely." "That's cutting it close." "Yes, it is." Her voice was dry. "Try to have a good 18 minutes, Commander." The call ended. Hale looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Rachel. "Strand filed an evidence hold through military court," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were steady. "The transmission is already out of the building. The hold can't reach it. Reyes is running interference on the judge. 15 to 18 minutes. Then we're fine. Probably." "You keep using that word the same way I use okay," she said, like it's technically accurate and functionally meaningless. He almost smiled. "Probably accurate, too." 16 minutes later, Iris Vance sent a second message. "Transmission complete. Fielding's office has confirmed receipt. They've opened the index." Rachel read it, set the phone down, put both hands flat on the counter, and stood there for a moment with her head slightly down, not dramatically, just the particular posture of someone absorbing the end of a very long effort. The files were with Margot Fielding. 3 years of documentation, 11 names, 4 drives, the Praxis Meridian network, the shell accounts, the falsified mission logs, the testimonies of people who had trusted Rachel with information that could have destroyed them if mishandled. Aldous Ferris's name, the aid workers, the translators, the woman who had talked to a journalist 3 weeks before she died. All of it, now in the hands of someone with the authority and the will to do something about it. Hale sent a one-word text to Reyes. "Done." Reyes's response came back 3 minutes later. Pruitt's office just withdrew the hold application. Interesting timing. And then, after a pause that was probably 5 minutes but felt shorter, Fielding's office contacted me directly. "They're initiating a federal review. You're going to have a busy morning, Commander." What happened over the next 6 hours moved with the particular speed of events that had been building pressure for a long time before finding a release point. At 100, Margot Fielding's office contacted 3 separate federal law enforcement agencies simultaneously, initiating preliminary review requests under the independent prosecutorial authority that her office held. The requests were sealed, which meant Strand's network wouldn't see them coming through public channels. At 02:20, Iris Vance transmitted the supplemental documentation on the 3 additional nodes to Fielding directly. The material she'd found that wasn't in Rachel's original files, the financial trails that connected the political network to Praxis's contract renewal process. Fielding's senior investigator spent 40 minutes with the index and sent back 2 questions, both of which Iris was able to answer within the hour using the parallel documentation she'd been building for 18 months. At 0400, Hale was finally convinced by Kroll to sleep for 2 hours on the cot in the quarantine building's second room. He slept badly and woke at 0545 when his phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number that turned out to be one of Fielding's investigators, requesting a recorded statement about the events at Ironcliff beginning with the SAR recovery on Thursday morning. He showered in the building's small bathroom, drank bad coffee from the unit's ancient machine, and sat across a table from a woman named Investigator Pratt, who had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had done this exact thing many times, and understood that patience was a form of precision. He told her everything, all of it in order, without editorializing. Where he'd been uncertain, he said so. Where he'd made judgment calls that might look questionable from the outside, he explained the reasoning without dressing it up. Pratt took notes and recorded the session and asked follow-up questions that were pointed and specific and suggested she had already read the file index very carefully. At the end, she looked at her notes and said, "For the record, when you turned the aircraft around over the debris field, you had no knowledge of who the survivor was or what she was carrying." "Correct. You made the call on survival probability alone." "The survival metric said she was dead," Hale said. "Something was moving. I went with the thing that was moving." Pratt made a note. "That's going to matter later," she said, and moved on. Count. Rachel's statement took 4 hours. Hale didn't hear it. Pratt conducted it with a second investigator in the building's main room while Hale waited outside with Obi, who had been awake for approximately 27 hours and was functioning on vending machine food and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided they were staying until something was definitively resolved. "You think she's okay in there?" Obi said at one point. "She's been building this case for 3 years," Hale said. "Talking to someone who actually wants to hear it is probably the least difficult thing she's done in a while." Obi thought about this. "Weird life she's had." "Yeah. Weird week we've had." "Also, yeah." When Rachel came out at 1100, she looked like she'd lost 10 pounds since entering the room, which wasn't physically possible but was emotionally accurate. She stood in the doorway for a moment, blinking in the November light, and then she sat down on the step and put the bag on the ground beside her feet, still connected to her by habit, the strap looped around her ankle, and didn't say anything for a while. Hale sat on the step beside her, didn't push it. After maybe 3 minutes, she said, "Fielding's team found something in the second tier that I didn't catch." He waited. "The financial routing for the political network ran through a holding account associated with one of Praxis's legitimate subsidiary accounts. Standard corporate architecture, nothing unusual on the surface. But the holding account had a dual authorization structure, meaning every transaction required sign-off from 2 people." She paused. "One of them was Strand. The other was a name I didn't recognize in my documentation." Fielding's investigator identified it as a former DoD deputy secretary who left the department 14 months ago and moved into private consulting. "Connected to the committee member?" "Connected to all of them. The deputy secretary was the connective tissue between the Praxis network and the legislative protection layer. He was the translator, the person who knew both worlds and could move between them without raising flags." Her voice was precise and tired. "He's been in private consulting for 14 months, which means he's been operating outside the protective cover of his former position, but still inside the network, still taking money, still making introductions. Fielding can reach him." "Fielding can reach him," Rachel agreed. "But it's going to be complicated because he has relationships across both parties and a reputation as a good faith actor in defense policy circles. The kind of person whose name, when it appears in a federal investigation, makes very senior people pick up phones before they think about whether they should." "Is that going to slow things down?" Rachel looked at the ground. "It's going to make things messier, which is different from stopping them." She paused. "Nothing stops them now. The files are with Fielding. The authentication is solid. The chain of custody is documented. Firth is in holding, and her presence here is itself part of the evidentiary record." She stopped. It's messy, and it's complicated. And some of the people in that second tier are going to hire the best lawyers available and fight every step of it. But they're going to be fighting from inside a federal investigation, not outside of one. That's different. How different? She finally looked up. The November sky above the facility was gray and flat, the kind of sky that committed fully to its own indifference. The difference between running, she said, and being chased. Chug. At 1400, Iris Vance arrived at Ironcliff in person for the first time. She turned out to be a slight woman in her late 30s with dark circles under her eyes and a laptop bag over one shoulder that she clutched with the same reflexive protectiveness Rachel had with the medical bag. She and Rachel stood facing each other in the quarantine building's entrance for a moment. Two people who had been working in parallel toward the same target for over a year without ever being in the same room. "You're taller than I thought," Iris said. "You sound younger than I thought," Rachel said. They shook hands. It was not a warm moment exactly, but it was a real one. Two people making contact across a distance that had been abstract for a long time. Iris sat down with her laptop and walked Rachel and Hale through what she'd found. The 3 additional nodes, the Deputy Secretary's dual authorization role, the full extent of the political network as she'd traced it across 14 months of parallel work. The picture that emerged was larger than Rachel's documentation alone, but consistent with it. The 2 independent bodies of evidence, built separately, pointed at the same architecture from different angles. "Together," Iris said, "it's airtight. Separately, both of our cases have vulnerabilities. Together, the corroboration fills every gap." "Fielding knows this?" Hale asked. She said it herself in the briefing call at 800. Her exact words were, "This is the most thoroughly documented case of systemic defense contractor corruption I have reviewed in 22 years of prosecutorial work." Iris paused. "She's not given to overstatement, for the record." Rachel absorbed this without visible reaction, which was itself a reaction. The careful stillness of someone who has wanted something for a very long time and does not yet trust that having it is permanent. "What happens next?" Hale asked. Iris looked at her laptop. Fielding's office is coordinating with 3 federal agencies simultaneously. Asset freeze orders for the Praxis subsidiary accounts are going through the Financial Crimes Division. The military officers in the documentation have been referred to the DODIG for expedited review. 2 of them were already under separate informal inquiry, which means Fielding has a running start on establishing a pattern. She paused. "Strand himself. He's lawyered up," Rachel said. It wasn't a question. By 0600 this morning, 4 attorneys. His public communications team released a statement at 0730 characterizing the investigation as a politically motivated attack on Praxis Meridian's record of service. Iris's voice was neutral. The statement included a personal message from Strand describing himself as a lifelong advocate for American military readiness. The room was very quiet. "How did that land?" Hale asked. By 0900, 2 of his own board members had privately contacted Fielding's office to indicate their willingness to cooperate with the investigation. The kind of loyalty that lived inside a $9 billion defense empire, it turned out, had very specific conditions. At 1600 hours, Hale's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered because at this point, unknown numbers had stopped being inherently alarming and had become simply part of the landscape. "Commander Hale." The voice was male, older, with the particular compression of someone accustomed to delivering information without preamble. "My name is Deputy Director Forrest Albright. I'm with the Department of Justice, Office of Professional Responsibility. I've been briefed on the situation at Ironcliff and on your role in the events of the past 48 hours. "Yes, sir." "I want you to understand that what you did, protecting the evidence, facilitating the transmission to Fielding's office, and detaining Lena Firth, all of it was conducted outside of normal protocol. There are people in the chain of command who are going to have opinions about that." "I understand." "I'm calling to tell you that those opinions are going to have a very difficult time gaining traction, given the nature of what the evidence contains and the identities of the people implicated in it." A pause. "In plain terms, Commander, you made the right call at every step, and the people who might otherwise have created problems for you are currently managing their own significantly larger problems." Hale looked at the wall for a moment. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Thank your witness for building a case that doesn't have holes in it. Another pause. Fielding's office is going to need your full cooperation going forward. Whatever you need to facilitate that, clearance, access, administrative cover, put the request through Reyes and it will be processed. The call ended. Hale sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he went to find Rachel. She was in the small room she'd slept in the night before, not sleeping now, sitting on the edge of the bed with the tablet from the bag open on her knees. Working. Still, even now, working. Reviewing something, cross-referencing, the same focused expression she'd had when he first understood that she was not who he'd assumed she was. He stood in the doorway. DOJOPR just called. We're clear. Fielding has full authorization to proceed. She looked up, read his face. Strand's board members are cooperating, he added. 2 of them, as of this morning. Rachel nodded once, looked back at the tablet, then she closed it carefully and set it on the bed beside her. There's one more thing, she said. Something I didn't tell Fielding's investigator this morning because I didn't have the corroboration yet. She picked up the tablet again and turned it toward him. The screen showed a financial document, transaction records, account numbers, a timeline. Iris found this in the deputy secretary's records, a payment made 11 months ago to a private maritime logistics company, the same company that owned the aircraft I was on when I went into the Atlantic. Hale went still. The crash wasn't a field decision, Rachel said. Her voice was completely level. It wasn't someone reacting to the fact that I'd been located. It was planned. The logistics company was on Strand's network payroll for 8 months before I ever boarded that flight. She paused. They knew which route I was going to take before I booked it, which means there was a leak somewhere in the network I used to establish the booking. The implication was immediate and cold. Someone in your support network gave you up, Hale said. Yes. She looked at the document. And that person's name is in these records. She turned the tablet toward him again and pointed to a line item in the transaction record, a name in the payee field that Hale didn't recognize, but Rachel's expression said she did, and that whatever she felt about it, whatever specific quality of betrayal lived in the gap between the name on the screen and the person she'd trusted. She had been carrying it alone since Iris sent the records 2 hours ago, and the weight of it was visible in exactly the way she would have hated for anyone to see. The name in the payee field was Marcus Dunn. Rachel had known Marcus Dunn for 6 years. He'd been a logistics coordinator in the same special operations support network she'd used during her last 18 months of active service. One of those people who existed in the infrastructure between official channels, the kind of person who knew how to move things and people without leaving a trail that the wrong eyes could follow. She'd used him twice during the 3 years she'd been building the case, once to establish a dead drop in Reykjavik, once to route her booking for the flight that put her in the Atlantic. She had considered him careful, professional, someone whose motivations were mercenary in the clean, transactional sense. He did the work, took the money, kept his mouth shut. She had not considered him dangerous. She had been wrong about that, not about his professionalism. The record showed that he'd done exactly what he'd been paid to do, precisely and without hesitation. She'd been wrong about who else was paying him. How long? Hale asked. The first payment from Strand's network to the logistics company Dunn works through was 8 months before my flight, she said, but Iris found a secondary account. Smaller, direct, not run through the company structure. That one goes back 14 months. She looked at the tablet. He wasn't waiting for me to hire him. He was already positioned, waiting for me to use him. The specific cruelty of it was not that she'd been betrayed. People in the work she'd been doing got betrayed. It was built into the architecture of operating in the dark for a long time with limited visibility into who else was watching. The specific cruelty was the 14 months. 14 months of Marcus Dunn being in place and Rachel moving through her own operation with the assumption that she was choosing her resources carefully when the choice itself had been engineered. He's still reachable? Hale asked. Iris has his location. He's currently in Reykjavik. Her voice was very flat. Probably because the dead drop he helped me set up there gave him a reason to establish a presence that doesn't look connected to anything. Hale looked at the transaction records on the tablet. looked at the dates. Then he picked up his phone and called Reyes. The conversation with Reyes was short. She listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions, and then said she would make contact with Fielding's office directly. The Reykjavik element moved it into international jurisdiction, which added a layer of complexity, but the financial documentation Iris had pulled was already in Fielding's hands, and the records themselves established the criminal nexus clearly enough to support an international arrest request through the appropriate channels. "He's not going anywhere he can disappear to," Reyes said. "The banking records alone would be enough to freeze his mobility within 48 hours. After the call, Hale put his phone down and looked at Rachel. She was staring at the transaction records with the expression of someone doing the internal accounting that follows a specific kind of discovery. Not grief exactly, because she and Marcus Dunn had never been close in any sense that used that word correctly. More like the adjustment you made when a structural assumption turned out to be false. All the weight you'd put on it had to be redistributed, and for a moment you felt the full load. "You couldn't have known," he said. "I know." She closed the tablet. "That's the part that doesn't help." He didn't push it. Some truths about your own judgment, the places where your read on a person failed at exactly the wrong moment, didn't benefit from being reassured away. They needed to sit for a while before they became something manageable. What he could do, and what he did, was sit in the chair across from her and stay there, not filling the silence, just being in it. After a while, Rachel said, "I need to call Fielding directly." "Okay. And then I need to sleep. Actual sleep, not 2 hours on a cot. That can be arranged." She looked at him, that direct, evaluating look she'd been giving him since the first moment she'd been conscious enough to take him in as an individual rather than a category. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "Across all of this. You could have handed me to the MPs and gone back to flying." He thought about the honest answer. "I think partly because I pulled you out of the water, and that felt like a commitment to something I hadn't fully defined yet." He paused. "And partly because you told me about Aldous Ferris." She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she nodded, once, in the way that meant something without turning it into a statement. She picked up the phone. The call with Fielding lasted 40 minutes, and Rachel was on her feet for most of it, moving in the small space of the room the way she did when she was thinking fast. Not pacing, more like the slight continuous repositioning of someone whose mind was running ahead of the conversation, and the body was trying to keep up. Hale stayed outside the door. He could hear the tone of Rachel's voice without the words, and what he heard was something he hadn't heard from her before. The forward-leaning engagement of someone who had been operating alone for a very long time and was now, finally, working with a counterpart who had both the authority and the willingness to move. When she came out, her face was different. Not relaxed. He doubted she did relaxed in any conventional sense, but something had shifted in the holding pattern of her expression. The wariness was still there, but it was sitting differently, less load-bearing. "Fielding is moving on all of it simultaneously," she said. "Praxis accounts, the 11 primary names, the 3 political network nodes, and Marcus Dunn. She's coordinating the international request for Dunn through her office's liaison at the State Department." She paused. "She said something I want to tell you because I think you should hear it." He waited. "She said the corroboration between my documentation and Iris's parallel investigation is the thing that makes this case prosecution-ready rather than investigation-ready. That either set of files alone would have been a serious evidentiary foundation. Together, they're—" Rachel stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. She said together, "They're the kind of case that comes through her office maybe once a decade." Hale didn't say anything. "I'm telling you because Iris should hear it too," Rachel said. "She spent 18 months on this. She made the call to contact you when she didn't have to. She found the 3 nodes I missed." A pause. "She deserves to know what it added up to." The next 72 hours moved with a speed that was both expected and disorienting. Asset freeze orders executed against 7 Praxis Meridian accounts within 24 hours of Fielding's office completing its preliminary evidentiary review. The freeze orders were sealed initially, which gave Strand's legal team no advance warning. The first indication the company had that the financial architecture was being dismantled was when a routine inter-account transfer failed to execute, and the compliance officer called the bank to inquire and was told that the account had been placed under federal hold. Victor Strand called a press conference at 1100 on Saturday morning. He stood in front of the Praxis Meridian headquarters in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salaries and spoke for 11 minutes about the company's record of service. The politically motivated nature of what he characterized as a fishing expedition by rogue elements within the federal prosecutorial infrastructure, and his full confidence that the truth would vindicate both himself and the organization he had built. He answered 4 questions from journalists. On the 5th question, from a reporter who had clearly been briefed, because the specificity of it couldn't have come from the public record, about the dual authorization payment structure on the political network accounts, Strand's composure fractured for exactly 3 seconds before he reassembled it. 3 seconds. On camera, with 12 journalists in the room, the clip circulated for the rest of the day. By 1800 Saturday, the 2 board members who had contacted Fielding's office on Friday morning had been joined by a 3rd. By Sunday morning, Praxis Meridian's chief legal officer had also made contact under the specific provision that allowed for cooperation agreements in federal investigations. The company's infrastructure was not collapsing. It was choosing, piece by piece, which parts of itself it was willing to sacrifice in order to preserve the rest. Which was its own kind of collapse, slower, more deliberate, and in some ways more damning than a sudden implosion, because it made visible the calculated nature of every relationship inside the network. Everyone who could cooperate and gain advantage by doing so did. The ones who held out were the ones with nowhere left to go. Strand held out for 48 hours after the press conference. On Sunday night, his legal team contacted Fielding's office with a request to discuss terms. Fielding's response, which Reyes passed to Hale and Hale relayed to Rachel, was 4 words. Terms are off the table. Pauchab. Marcus Dunn was detained in Reykjavik on Sunday afternoon through the coordinated effort of Icelandic law enforcement and a federal agent from Fielding's office who had flown out Saturday night. He did not resist. He made no statement. He asked for American legal representation and sat down in a room in the Reykjavik Central Police Station and waited. Rachel was told about the detention by Iris, who heard it from Fielding's investigator, and she sat with that information for a moment before she said anything. Good, she said. Just the one word. Iris, who was sitting across the table from her in the quarantine building where they'd both been working for the last day and a half, nodded. Are you okay? Iris asked. She said it the way someone asked it when they actually wanted to know, not as a conversational filler. Rachel thought about the honest answer. I will be. That's different from yes. Yes, it is. Iris looked at her laptop for a moment, then she closed it. I've been tracking this network for 18 months, and I never built what you built. I was working the signals side, communication patterns, financial flows, structural mapping. You were in the rooms, she paused. I don't know how you held on to it for 3 years without... She stopped, didn't finish. Without what? Iris looked at her. Without losing the thread of why it mattered. While you were running. While you were alone. A pause. Most people would have put it down at some point, decided it was too much. Rachel was quiet for a moment. I picked up the list, she said. Whenever it got close to too much, I looked at the names on it. Not the names of the people I was going after, the other names. She paused. Aldous Ferris, a woman named Taylin Park, who was an aid worker, a translator named Bowen Marsh, whose family never got an official explanation for what happened to him. She looked at the table. You can't put it down when you're the only person holding those names. Iris didn't say anything for a moment. Then she opened her laptop again. Let's finish going through the index so Fielding has everything she needs for the Monday briefing. The Monday briefing at Fielding's office in Halifax convened via secure video link because the investigation had expanded to include parties in 3 jurisdictions, lasted 4 hours, and covered the full evidentiary architecture of the case. Rachel and Iris participated together for the first time in an official capacity. Hale gave a supplemental statement on the events at Ironcliff. Reyes provided the administrative record of Pruitt's inquiry and the evidence hold attempt, which had become, in the context of the broader investigation, an additional evidentiary thread pointing toward the coordinated nature of the suppression effort. Brigadier General Wallace Pruitt had been placed on administrative leave pending the DoD Inspector General review on Saturday. The suspension was not public yet, but it would be. The IG's office had a timeline of 14 days for preliminary findings, which everyone involved understood was a formality. The documentation in Rachel's files cross-referenced against Pruitt's own administrative record created a pattern that didn't require interpretation. The two other flag officers named in the documentation were in different stages of the same process. One had retained counsel and was cooperating. The other had gone to his own chain of command voluntarily on Saturday, which was either a genuine attempt at self-disclosure or a calculated attempt to control the framing, and either way, it was happening inside the walls of an active federal investigation, which meant the framing was Fielding's to set. By Tuesday, the legislative angle became public, not through a leak, through a voluntary disclosure by one of the committee staff members who had been on the periphery of the network, someone whose name appeared in the documentation in a minor capacity, a single meeting, a single reference in a financial record, and who had apparently spent the weekend calculating that being the person who came forward was considerably better than being the person who was found. The disclosure named the committee member directly. By noon Tuesday, the committee member's office had issued a statement announcing that the member was voluntarily cooperating with a federal inquiry and had requested a temporary leave of absence from committee responsibilities. The statement contained the phrase, "I take full responsibility," in the first paragraph. It was, as such statements went, exactly as meaningful and exactly as inadequate as every other statement that had ever used those four words, and everyone reading it understood both of those things simultaneously. Rachel watched the coverage on a laptop in the quarantine building with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She watched Strand's press conference clip again, the 11 minutes, not just the 3-second fracture that had circulated. She watched the way he held himself through the prepared statement, the specific quality of confidence he projected, the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades being the person in the room that other people deferred to. She thought about a meeting room in a forward operating base in a country she couldn't name in this context 9 years ago, where she'd sat against a wall waiting to be dismissed while 3 men in that room made decisions about what had happened on an operation she'd been part of that week. She'd had questions. She'd been told politely that the operational debrief was complete and her medical report had been filed and she was free to go. She'd gone. And she'd started writing things down that same night, 9 years from that room to this coverage. 3 years of active documentation, 71 hours in the North Atlantic, 48 hours at Ironcliff, and now a federal investigation with subpoena authority, 11 primary targets, a cooperating board, and a committee member issuing public statements about taking full responsibility. It didn't feel like victory exactly. She wasn't sure she'd expected it to. Victory in the movies had a sound and a shape, something swelling and conclusive. This felt more like the specific relief of setting down something that had been very heavy for a very long time. Not triumph, release. She thought about Aldous Ferris, Taylin Park, Bowen Marsh, the woman who'd talked to a journalist. They would never know any of this had happened. That was a fact with a particular weight that didn't get lighter just because the investigation was moving. The cases for all of them were being referred by Fielding's office to a separate unit that handled historical wrongful death investigations. Cases that could potentially be officially reopened, families that could potentially be notified, records that could potentially be corrected. Potentially was doing a lot of work in those sentences. Some of them would result in something. Some of them would end in the same bureaucratic quiet that most things ended in. But their names were in the official record now. They were part of the evidentiary foundation of a federal case that was going to be a matter of public record. That was something. Not enough, but something. She picked up her coffee, remembered it was cold, and put it back down. Hale found her there at 1500. He had 2 fresh cups from a coffee shop that Obi had identified as the closest thing to functional within 3 miles of the base, and he set one in front of her without ceremony and sat down. The DODIG released preliminary findings, he said. Pruitt, they're recommending formal charges. Rachel wrapped both hands around the cup. Which charges? Abuse of authority, obstruction of a federal investigation. That's the evidence hold attempt. and conduct unbecoming. He paused. They're still building on the Praxis connection. That's going to take longer. It always takes longer, she said. Not bitterly, just accurately. Strand's lawyers made a second approach to Fielding this morning. Through a back channel this time, not the formal route, a personal message to one of her investigators. He paused. Fielding sent back one line. What line? This office does not accept personal messages on matters under active prosecution. Rachel looked at her coffee. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but in the same neighborhood. She's good. Apparently she's been doing this for 22 years. It shows. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who had been through something together and were still in the middle of the aftermath, where the urgency had dropped, but the weight of it was still present. What happens to you now? Rachel asked. Hale considered it. Debrief process. Administrative review of my decisions during the incident. There are going to be people who have opinions about an SAR pilot making unilateral security decisions at a military medical facility. He paused. Reyes thinks the context makes the review a formality. I'm inclined to trust her read on that. And after? Back to flying eventually. SAR is... He paused. Thought about how to say this accurately. It's the work I know how to do. Finding people in places where the calculus says there's nothing left to find. A beat. Turns out I've been doing a version of that for 11 years without realizing it covered more territory than I thought. Rachel looked at him. You're not as straightforward as you seem. Nobody is. No, she agreed. They're not. On Thursday, 8 days after Briggs had gone into the water and pulled Rachel out of the Atlantic, Fielding's office held a formal press briefing. It was not the kind of press briefing that featured dramatic revelations or choreographed moments. Fielding herself was a small woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the manner of someone who found press briefings mildly irritating, but understood their function in the larger architecture of public accountability. She stood at a podium in a conference room in Halifax and read from a prepared statement in a clear, unhurried voice. The statement outlined the scope of the investigation, the categories of conduct under examination, the number of individuals under active federal review, and the status of the evidentiary record. It used words like systemic and coordinated and multi-year in the precise, non-inflammatory way that prosecutors used words when the facts themselves were inflammatory enough without help. When she reached the section on how the investigation had been initiated, she said the following. The evidentiary foundation of this investigation derives from documentation assembled over a period of 3 years by a former U.S. Army combat nurse whose determination to bring these matters to the attention of appropriate oversight bodies persisted through significant personal risk and direct attempts to suppress the evidence she had compiled. Her work, corroborated independently by a second investigator operating in parallel, represents a level of dedication to accountability that this office has rarely encountered in its history. She did not name Rachel in the public statement. That was Rachel's choice, communicated to Fielding's office the day before. The investigation needed to be about the evidence and the people the evidence implicated, not about the person who'd built the case. Names in press briefings became targets, and Rachel had spent enough time being a target. But Fielding had insisted on one thing, the record. The official investigative record, which would eventually be partially disclosed through the public trial process, would contain Rachel's full name, her service history, the nature of her documentation, and the complete account of how the evidence had been preserved and transmitted. That record would exist. Courts would cite it, legal scholars would read it, journalists who dug deep enough would find it. It would be there. Rachel watched the press briefing on the same laptop, in the same room, with coffee that was actually hot this time. Iris sat across from her. Obi was in the doorway. Kroll was somewhere behind her. She could hear the creak of the old chair she'd been sitting in for the last 3 days. When Fielding's statement reached the part about the former Army combat nurse, nobody in the room said anything. Rachel's jaw moved slightly, barely visible, the small muscular adjustment of someone receiving something they'd been waiting a long time for and were now having to figure out how to hold. She reached down and put her hand on the bag. Old habit. She noticed herself doing it, the automatic reach for the thing she'd been protecting. The weight of it, the physical reassurance of its presence, 3 years of that reflex, 71 hours in the Atlantic with her fingers locked around it, days in this building with the strap looped around her ankle. She left her hand on it for a moment. Then she let go. The full consequences unfolded across the weeks that followed in the way that institutional reckoning usually unfolded. Not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily, with the particular momentum of a process that had been properly set in motion. Victor Strand was indicted on 14 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government, obstruction of justice, and in one count that Fielding's team had built with particular care, accessory liability in connection with the deaths of 3 individuals whose cases had been formally reopened. He surrendered to federal authorities on a Tuesday morning through his lawyers in a building in downtown Halifax, wearing the same kind of expensive suit he'd worn to the press conference. The photos circulated widely. In every one of them, he was looking slightly to the left of the cameras, which was probably intentional and looked exactly like what it was. Lena Firth negotiated a cooperation agreement that reduced her exposure significantly in exchange for detailed testimony about the operational layer of Strand's network. She gave 40 hours of recorded testimony over 3 weeks. Her cooperation was, by all accounts, thorough and precise, the quality of someone who had decided that the most useful thing she could do with the situation she was in was to do it completely. The agreement didn't eliminate her liability, it shaped it. Marcus Dunn was extradited from Iceland and charged with conspiracy and material support for the maritime operation that had been intended to kill Rachel. His defense, as outlined in early court filings, centered on a characterization of his role as limited to logistics with no direct knowledge of the intended outcome. Fielding's team had the financial records, the timeline, and 14 months of payments. The defense's characterization had a difficult road. Brigadier General Pruitt faced a military tribunal and separate federal charges. The 2 flag officers named in Rachel's documentation faced similar processes at different stages. The committee member who had issued the statement about taking full responsibility appeared before a closed ethics committee hearing on the 3rd Wednesday after the initial briefing. The outcome of that hearing would take months. The member had already announced they would not seek re-election. The families of Aldous Ferris, Taylin Park, and Bowen Marsh were formally notified by Fielding's office that their cases had been reopened under the evidentiary record of the investigation. The notifications were delivered in person by investigators who had been given specific direction to be honest about what the reopening could and could not promise. Some families were reachable. Some had scattered. One of Bowen Marsh's daughters, a woman in her early 30s who had grown up not knowing exactly what had happened to her father, requested and received a meeting with Fielding's office that lasted 2 hours. What came out of that meeting was not resolution. There was no version of that meeting that ended in resolution, but it was acknowledgement. Official, documented, permanent acknowledgement. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. Those 2 things could both be true, and they were. Rachel left Ironcliff on a Friday, 3 weeks after she'd arrived on a helicopter with hypothermia and a bag she wouldn't let go of. Her discharge paperwork from Ironcliff's medical staff was, by any clinical measure, unremarkable. Recovered hypothermia patient, no permanent cardiac damage. Residual peripheral neuropathy in 3 fingers of her left hand, likely to improve over 6 to 12 months, might not fully resolve. Nutritional deficiencies corrected. Cleared for return to normal activity, with follow-up recommended in 30 days. The follow-up recommendation assumed she had a normal life to return to. She stood in the parking lot in the same clothes Obi had found for her in the basement, the cargo pants, the thermal underlayer, the fleece, and held the bag and looked at the building for a moment. November had deepened since she'd arrived. The light was lower, the cold more settled, the trees at the edge of the facility's perimeter fully stripped. Kroll shook her hand. Then, apparently deciding that was insufficient, pulled her into a brief, firm hug that Rachel stood inside with the slight awkwardness of someone who hadn't been hugged in a while. Kroll pulled back and didn't comment on it. Obi, who had managed to be present at most of the significant moments of the last 3 weeks without ever making himself conspicuous, said, "You need a ride somewhere? Iris is picking me up." "Good." He nodded. "You should get somewhere warm, eat something regular, sleep more than 4 hours in a row." That's remarkably practical advice. I'm a remarkably practical person. She almost smiled, the real kind, not the exhausted approximation. Hale walked her out. They stood near the building's edge, out of the main foot traffic, while Iris's car moved through the gate in the middle distance. Fielding's office is going to need you available for the duration of the trial process, he said. That's months, maybe longer if Strand's team fights everything. I know. I'll be available. And after that? She looked at the bag in her hand. Then she looked at him. Fielding mentioned there are 3 other cases her office has been watching for years without sufficient evidentiary foundation to pursue, she said. Cases with similar structural signatures to what I built. Defense contracting irregularities. Civilian casualties and off-book operations. Records that don't match outcomes. She paused. She asked if I'd considered a consulting role, helping build the evidentiary architecture for investigations that need someone who knows how to document in environments where documentation isn't supposed to happen. Hale was quiet for a moment. That sounds like a way to spend the next several years in difficult places doing work nobody outside a courtroom will ever fully understand. Yes, Rachel said. It does. Is that what you want? She thought about the honest answer, the one that didn't flatten itself into something easier to say. She thought about the long years of operating alone, the weight of the names, the specific loneliness of building a case that nobody else knew was being built. She thought about what Iris had asked her in this same building a week ago. How did you hold on to it? And the answer she'd given, which was accurate but incomplete. The complete answer was that she'd held on to it because the alternative was a version of herself she didn't recognize. Not a peaceful version. Not a version that had put something down and found rest. A version that had looked at the names on a list and decided the distance between herself and the problem was more important than the problem. She couldn't get to that version of herself. The distance never opened up. It's the work I know how to do, she said. Hale's words from earlier back in his voice. The work I know how to do. He heard the echo. Something in his face acknowledged it without making a thing of it. Iris's car pulled up. Rachel picked up the bag. Then she stopped, looked at it, looked at Hale. She held it out. He blinked. Rachel, the drives are with Fielding. The documentation is in the federal record. The tablet is backed up to 3 separate secure locations. She held the bag steady. I've been carrying this for 3 years. It's done what it was supposed to do. He took it. It was heavier than it looked, even without the drives, because of the waterproofing and the reinforced base and 3 years of weight it had accumulated that wasn't physical. He held it for a moment. What do I do with it? She opened the car door, looked back at him. Keep it where someone will find it if they need to. Some piece of evidence, some record, some name. You never know what someone's going to need to find later. She paused. That's all any of it ever was. Things that needed to be found. She got in the car. Iris pulled away from the curb and through the gate and onto the road that led out of Ironcliff and into the gray November day. Rachel looked out the passenger window at the facility receding, at the flat light on the stripped trees, at the long road stretching forward. The bag was not in her hands. The strap was not looped around her ankle. Her hands were in her lap, not gripping anything. It felt strange. Like the particular strangeness of a sound you've lived with for so long that its absence is louder than it was. Where do you want to go? Iris asked. Rachel thought about it. A real answer, not a logistical one. Not wherever the next flight goes or somewhere I can work. An actual place. A direction chosen rather than calculated. Somewhere that has decent coffee and a window, she said. I want to sit somewhere warm and look outside for a while without running the geometry of the exits. Iris drove for a moment. Then, I know a place in Dartmouth, an hour from here. Good coffee, big windows, and the view is a harbor, so there aren't any exits to run geometry on. That works. They drove. The road widened and the facility fell behind, and the November sky came down close to the flat gray land on both sides. Rachel leaned her head back against the seat. She was not at peace exactly. Peace wasn't the right word for someone who had spent 3 years building a case that was now in the hands of federal prosecutors and would take months or years to fully resolve. Peace was for later, if it came. But she was moving forward without the weight of what she'd been carrying in the direction of a window and good coffee in a harbor with no exits to calculate, and she was not running. For the first time in 3 years, she was not running. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. And the difference between those two things was the whole distance between surviving and choosing. She had spent a very long time surviving. Now she was choosing. A harbor. A window. An hour of stillness between one part of her life and whatever came next. The car moved through the gray November light, and Rachel Voss kept her hands open in her lap, holding nothing, and looked out at the road ahead.